Great. Well, thanks for the invite. This is I presented a few years ago now, I think. Time really flies, at one of the breakfasts. So this is kind of building on that. This is ongoing research that I've been doing for many, many years. And so I'm building on some of the models. And I agree that this is an important time for us to be having these discussions as we kind of work through how we can better value community knowledge and how universities could have more reciprocal, meaningful partnerships. I'm going to get my screen sharing, but I'd like in the chat, I mean, I'm still getting used to this kind of virtual presentations, right? And how to engage people and get to know people a little bit. We obviously don't have time to do introductions with such a large group, but if folks, if you feel comfortable, if you can just say in the chat, where you come, you know, what your department is, what program you're in, anything that will tell me a little bit, because it'll help me maybe gear some of my comments and examples towards your interests.
Yeah, and if you're from a nonprofit or community-based
Yes, that's
organization, let
great.
us
Yes.
know. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that this is the center has a wide reach, so that's really wonderful. I love seeing community folks here as well as academics. So please share. And I'm going to share my screen. Well, greetings from Colorado. All right. Of course, now I can't really see the chat very well. So I want to see this chat.
And I can monitor it too, Laura. So I'll let you know if people have questions, no problem. But thank you for everybody who wants to put in a little bit
we
about
have
them.
folks from all over, so that's really wonderful. Here in Chicago, it's that's where I live. It's unseasonably warm. It's been in the 70s all week. So there was a lot of reveling this weekend. I feel like Chicago has this kind of collective hangover from all the good weather, and people are enjoying the great weather and the last bit to be outside for us before we kind of head in for the winter, which I think is going to be a long one. As was mentioned, my name is Laura Ruth Johnson. I'm in the College of Education and Educational Technology Research and Assessment. And I see some familiar names, so that's really wonderful in lots of different areas. Also apologize, there's dogs, in Chicago, our houses are really close together. We have these little walkways, and there's 3 big dogs or 2 big dogs and 1 little dog that actually is louder than some of the big dogs that hang out. So they'll be making some noise like a lot of you. I'm at home here with my daughter. She's usually pretty good about not interrupting me, but I just need to warn people that she's become very comfortable with this format. So I teach classes in qualitative research, and also do a lot of research in the area of community-based research. So just a little bit about me. I'm an associate professor, and how I got involved in working with communities, it goes way back before I became a professor. I served as the director of a family literacy program in Chicago for young parents from 94 to 98. And that's what really inspired me to go to graduate school in the first place. I really felt like the models that the community organization was using and that I was able to develop with them weren't adequately being built upon within universities and academic research. And the academic research and policies didn't really reflect what was happening in these community-based organizations. So I went to grad school and was hoping to do research then that could inform policy. And so, as I said, I teach qualitative research classes and have for many years. I haven't done it in a couple years, but for about 7 or 8 years, I taught a community-based and participatory action research course for graduate students in a community setting. So we met in Chicago and did collaborative research, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So currently, I collaborate with an alternative high school in Chicago to develop programs and services for pregnant and parenting youth, and those are a lot of examples that I'm going to share today. And my research interests include youth civic engagement with a focus on Latinx and African American pregnant and parenting youth, mentorship and advocacy for parenting youth, and community-based and participatory action research, as well as university community partnerships. And some of what I share is also stuff that I developed in a sabbatical last year in Taiwan and Puerto Rico, where I was studying community university partnerships and community-based research in diverse contexts. So there's a long history. I'm going to move some windows around here real quick. there's a long history of social science research that really exploits and pathologizes and objectivizes already marginalized community, and really uses research to further or strengthen deficit-oriented views of particular communities. And Alicia talked to that, you know, communities are often like, well, why would we want to work with universities given the way that we've been treated within the research or portrayed within the research? And so over the past couple of decades, there have been collaborative and participatory and community-based methods that have emerged, often as part of community university initiatives that have really aimed to challenge the subjectification, exploitation of communities with research, and really build research partnerships that address meaningful issues, community issues. Yet still, and I'm going to talk about this, some of these collaborative projects and approaches replicate aspects of the deficit-oriented work that, that I've critiqued, and that few of these partnerships really acknowledge communities as creators of theoretical knowledge. And so that's a little bit of what I want to talk about today, is how we can really learn from communities and with communities in meaningful ways. So what I wanted to do today is kind of provide a foundation for some of the existing models and orientations in community-based research, identify some key concepts, and discuss the design and implementation and dissemination of what I call community-based qualitative research. And I'm going to talk about a book that I wrote on this that was published a couple years ago. And then, like I said, provide some examples from my own community-based work with an alternative school serving Latinx and African-American youth in Chicago. And then I think important for us in kind of moving forward, and I like to have a little dialogue and discussion, if there's time, to explore how CBQR and other community-based approaches, because it really can help us rethink notions of university community partnerships and academic scholarship. So some of the critiques of research in communities is it's done on the community rather than with the community. And community members and stakeholders often have little input on the design of the study, and academic researchers really decide what is important and how it's studied. So that's a very traditional, I want to do research in this community, and they come in and they say, okay, here's the design of the study. Will you give me some folks, right? Or can I study you? And community members in this process aren't valued for the knowledge and expertise that they have. The academic researchers are viewed as sole experts. And this still happens a lot. I work as, I didn't mention in my bio, I'm also a board member at an alternative school network called Youth Connection Charter School. And they've talked about how often researchers, and I'm not going to name the university, of a very prestigious university in Chicago, kind of come in and say, okay, you need to give us students so that we can do this study. And they disrupt their day, right? You know, they take them out of class, and they don't ever talk to the staff and the teachers who have been doing this for many years and developed all these innovative approaches about what they find meaningful, what their knowledge is, what their skills and expertise are. And they kind of treat them in very demeaning ways, right? And it's often so that they can get money, you know, for their grants. And that's an example of how not to do this sort of research, but it still happens quite often, right? And that there should be, you know, in the kind of the critiques of research in communities, there's an emphasis on identifying and describing problems, that we're going to identify this problem rather than enacting change or transformation. So often there's not any kind of meaningful plan for change or transformation, and no resources brought to bear on that. And then often findings aren't shared with the community. So in examples I provided, they leave, right? And they go and they write it up, they get their grant, and they often, you know, sometimes they do extract knowledge from the insiders and then promote that as their own work and their own theorizing. And there's not a lot of opportunities for feedback. Once it's published, right? So there's not this kind of ongoing feedback loop that's really important. And that the findings are often disseminated narrowly and within the academic realm only. So as part of some reports, academic reports, or journal articles. And so this process can be very exploitative for communities and members, and that the findings often reinforce pejorative views of communities, particular communities. So I'm going to talk about kind of a continuum for community-based research. So even, as I mentioned, we want to strive for doing partnership models, right? But there is a continuum within the partnership models. And I developed this with a colleague, Michael Rodriguez-Muniz, who's a professor at Northwestern University. And he grew up in the Humboldt Park community and now does research within the community. And so we came up with this continuum that we presented at the American Studies Association conference a few years ago. It seems like just yesterday, but now I'm looking at 3 years ago. Community as data, community as research assistants, community as research collaborators, and community as theoretical interlocutors. So community as data, community members are seen really as objects of research, that the perspectives, experiences, and conditions of community members are merely raw data. Again, it's very extractive. Relationships are asymmetrical, so definitely weighted towards the university. and unilaterally extractive. So they go from community to research, and there's really no accountability on the part of the researchers to the community. So very traditional research methods are employed, and there's very limited substantive engagement. And so here's some examples of an ethnographic research with a gang in Chicago, and this researcher embedded himself as a member, gang leader for a day, and focused on the gang leader only rather than a broader community interactions and responses and issues. Or studies that are very common that use a community group, as I mentioned, or organization to collect data from individuals, residents through surveys, interviews, and the data is only used to identify or describe a problem. Now, many community-based studies might use communities as research assistants. So the community members support and participate in data collection. So they're not merely objects of research, but the relationship still remains asymmetrical, weighted towards the university, and largely extractive. There's limited accountability. It's mostly so that they can get access to individuals that might actually not talk to them. You know, so one of the issues is that if an outsider goes in to do research, a lot of community residents might not share information with them. So they kind of use community members as a way of getting access to populations that might be hard to engage with, right? And so still traditional methods are employed. And the engagement is mostly limited to training for data collection, like how to do a survey or how to do an interview. Now, communities as research collaborators, the community members are involved in the design and implementation of the research with the academic researcher. They're acknowledged for their skills and expertise. There's symmetrical relationships. They're seen as research partners and have full accountability. So some research activities in that are community immersion, experiences, training and research methods, collaborative discussions, and community forums to share findings. So there's much more engagement, much more reciprocity throughout the project. And so an example of this research is some earlier research that I did in civic engagement models in collaboration with a community organization and educators. So the teachers were involved in the design of the study and the development of research questions and interview guides and collected data. But then, you know, at this, a lot of the theorizing, right, came from the academic researchers. So we ended up writing up most of the articles, even though there were some. We did do one of the pictures is from the American Educational Research Association conference. And so we had proposed a symposium where the teachers and the students would attend with us in San Francisco and got funding. So, so that there was a discussion with teachers and students at the school about the educational study that we were doing. And actually, we also visited another school while we were there, which was really great, another alternative school. So, on the final end of the continuum is where the community is really seen as theoretical interlocutors, that they're treated as thinkers with valuable theories and concepts, and as producers of knowledge, not just sources, you know, that we mine for knowledge. So, and it's really premised on this idea of notions of communities as intellectual spaces that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And it really involves kind of a radical repositioning of academic and community roles, this redistribution of intellectual authority that Campano and his colleagues talk about. We're really forging asymmetrical relationships weighted towards communities, right? So that the communities have more weight in deciding what gets studied, what the study looks like, and the theorizing, and that academic researchers and community members are viewed as co-intellectuals. And there's something that I've developed called dialogic accountability, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And so research activities could include community-led conferences and symposia, community teach-ins, interviews that are viewed as intellectual exchanges, and then also co-authorship of articles and books. And so here's a definition. And community's intellectual space was developed within the community that I work in Humboldt Park, as part of this a group of educators from the graduate study program in library and information science at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And they were teaching classes within the community, and that's what inspired me to begin teaching a class in the community. And there were folks from DePaul also doing this. And so it brought together community leaders. Sorry, the dogs are, someone's passing by and the dogs are making a lot of noise. My apologies if it's disruptive. But bringing together community leaders, community activists, artists, politicians, academic researchers to really be able to understand and create solutions for problems in complex systems. And so this need for opportunities to engage with challenging problems, to learn through participative investigations, to have supported situated experiences, to express their ideas to others, and to make use of a variety of resources and multiple media. And so the aim of this was to bring people together from all walks of life to really develop what they referred to as critically socially engaged intelligence. And it also, I think it's also premised on this idea of communities as not as monolithic spaces. It's filled with lots of with academics and researchers and activists and teachers and students and artists and cultural workers, and bringing everyone together to discuss particular problems and issues. So what they would do every year is have a conference, and here's one of the conference symposia, Aesthetics as Resistance, the Act of Community Building. And we would do that every year and have, it was like no conference I've ever been to. You know, we had just a variety of keynotes, but also panels that included, and it took place in the community, that included community members and academic researchers in dialogue about pressing issues. Also another project is a Black Youth Project, BYP 100, that works with youth out of the University of Chicago, that works with youth on, they have a website and social media presence on using research to kind of transform community conditions, but also to engage youth as activists and researchers. And I'm sorry, I had changed this, but I don't think I saved it. So whatever I uploaded wasn't the saved version, but I can talk about it. There's also a project in Taiwan that I've been working with that that I've been studying, that I went to interview folks who were involved in that last year as part of my sabbatical, and had hoped to go back this fall, but because of COVID have not been able to travel back. But researchers that traveled to an indigenous community in the mountains not far from a university and really sought to learn from them about, especially related to environmental concerns and water rights, and had to spend years and years developing a relationship because of the years of exploitation of their community, right? And so it also involved valuing elders' knowledge and having elders be in charge of the project. And so it did involve this radical repositioning that I talked about. And then the dissemination of this project is that they're having, and that should have happened, I think it happened this year. I was supposed to go, but wasn't able to go, was an exhibit on their, in one of the major aquatic museums that wasn't usually known for foregrounding indigenous knowledge. And so what could we learn about climate change from listening to elders in this community? And so what is community-based qualitative research, this model that I'm going to talk about? It's an approach to research that really involves a collaborative and reciprocal process of teaching and learning. It involves community stakeholders and researchers and investigations to address relevant issues and problems and transform conditions. And it's really interested in understanding everyday issues and problems within particular local contexts. And it really draws heavily from critical and activist paradigms. And so this is the book that I published a couple years ago from SAGE that outlines this model more in depth and has a lot of examples from the class that I taught and my own work. And here's some related models. I'm not going to go into any of these in depth. Many of you are probably already familiar with them. So participatory action research, youth participatory action research, collaborative and reciprocal ethnography, as well as community-based participatory research, service learning models that are very popular at a lot of universities, and then community-based action research. So some key they need to do, for some reason, I can't see the time now. In my computer, my daughter stole my phone to play some games. So I don't know if, Alicia, could you do a time check for me?
Yep, you're good. You're 12:22.
Okay. So some key CBQR concepts are praxis, this roots in Aristotelian philosophy that focuses on practical knowledge with the end goal being action. So Paulo Freire has talked about praxis as a liberatory act involving a combination of reflection upon the world in order to transform it. And then I already talked about this idea of community as intellectual spaces, which really heavily undergirds all the work that I do in terms of how I view and work with communities. And then engaged learning. So learning really occurs through active participation in real life and authentic settings, rooted in the Vygotskian ideas of social learning, John Dewey's progressive philosophy of education, and then experiential learning theories. So some key elements of CBQR is that it should be collaborative, should be critical, and it should be transformative. And so I'm going to give examples from projects that I've done to talk about that. So in a collaborative, it's collaborative because research members are equal partners at all stages of the research process. There's opportunities for discussion and dialogue provided throughout the project, and that the leadership in the project is always shared. Although there might be a project director, it should always be shared. It isn't the traditional model of the academic researcher comes in and they're the ones in charge. I like models that you might have co-directors, so you would have someone from the community-based organization who might be viewed as the main liaison, right? And then also someone, an academic researcher. It's critical in that it really aims to challenge status quo narratives related to the topic under study and provide alternative voices through process of counter storytelling, a la Solorzano and Bernal, and connect what is happening in local communities to larger societal conditions. So even though we're interested in understanding and addressing the issues and concerns of particular local communities, we want to connect that with broader issues. And so when I do work with pregnant and parenting youth, we're always talking about them and embedding them in these larger debates and issues related to reproductive justice for pregnant and parenting youth. And then it's transformative, right? So I talked about how some of you, if you're in academia, you're familiar with, kind of journal article that maybe very few people read, right? And then you think, oh, I'm not really making a difference. And that's actually in the class that I taught in Humboldt Park. It started out as kind of a more traditional community-based ethnography class where students would go out to community sites and study certain issues and then write it up into a paper. And it was the students who really pushed me to say, we're not doing enough. Yeah, we're learning, we're becoming kind of more aware of community knowledge and expertise, but we actually want to make some more substantial changes. So we moved the class to more participatory and had students work on research proposals for projects, and then often they would build on those in independent studies or provide some assistance to the partners with an issue of concern. So it should have these transformative pedagogies where research members have opportunities for teaching and learning at all levels. And this is bi-directional. So it's really important for us to think about that the teaching and learning happens also from us learning from the community, not just us training community members in how to do research. And I think that's a really, really important point. And that it should bring about changes in perspectives and practices of research group members that changes their thinking. And I always have my students, when they have done community-based research, to reflect in their papers about how doing this sort of research changed their thinking about the topic under study, right? And also changed their notions of research and what a community is. And I often have them also do these kind of reflections at the beginning of the class to say, okay, what's your definition of research? What's your definition of community? What are your current views of the community? And many of them, towards the end, find that they were really transformed in ways that they had not expected. Even though they knew this was a community-based research class, they thought they were going to help everyone. And they're like, oh, I actually learned much more. And now I'm changed. This has changed my notion of what it means to be a parent, what it means to be an active citizen. And they might not say it at the beginning of the class, but they might have had reservations about doing research in a community that has been portrayed very negatively often in the media. And so by the end, they speak to how they loved coming, they love their experiences in the community, and they do become sort of ambassadors, right, for the community, which I think is wonderful. And it should be action oriented, right? So improve conditions, again, not just describing a problem. If you're going to come up with solutions, then how are you going to enact those, right? So not just, these are some things other people might want to do, but these are some things I think we could do. So improve conditions and expand resources for community residents and organizations is a really important part. So in terms of thinking about the design, I'm going to go through design, implementation, and dissemination, and thinking about how then these elements get woven into it. So in the design of a CBQR study, you might research the history of a community area so that you can gain important information about the social and historical context. That's always really important. Another part of doing CBQR is that there is a certain kind of orienting activities and tours that need to happen. I mean, you can't, if you're doing, and I'm sure that, those of you in nonprofits, when you've had academics come in and want to do research and then they don't know anything about the community, right? They just think, oh, well, like, I know about healthcare, so I can come in. And it's really, really important that academic researchers do their homework in terms of knowing about the community. What are the issues? And so I usually have, I organize tours, and have a community member do the tour. We have advanced readings, we have reflections that we do. And it helps build rapport, and then also decide, identify what issues are important to study. Usually there's a lot of meetings with community stakeholders and members in order to identify topics and issues and problems, and it takes quite a lot of dialogue. And you need to develop those research questions as part of dialogue groups. Again, you're not just coming in saying, I have these research questions, give me some people to work with, but it's something that is developed collaboratively. So then implementation and data collection analysis. And again, these are often in a lot of qualitative research, iterative and sort of recursive processes that go back and forth and not necessarily linear. So the data collection also often involves a lot of kind of design issues too, and you might have to go back to the design after collecting some data. So you would host community panels on particular issues and topics. I always did this in my class. So I would bring in youth, and we would do kind of a discussion interview to identify what were some issues that were important to them, so that the academic researchers are learning more about the community, and they're having a really robust discussion about the issues that the students care about. Sometimes I would have community members and experts and practitioners maybe discuss barriers to accessing health resources. We would train research group members in data collection analysis approaches. And I call this cross-training because it is very bidirectional. I think in a lot of community-based models, it's still that, oh, well, the academic researchers are going to teach community members how to do an interview, how to do a survey. And that might happen, that could happen. But I also need youth to provide insight into their use of social media. The kind of social media I use is really different, right? And so that's something they need to provide. What spaces, So I had one student one time in the class who was trying to, she had an idea, she wanted to look at literacy resources, and she was going to sites that she viewed as places where she could explore youth's use of literacy resources, right, and reading. And what she found is that's not where that was taking place. They weren't going to the library. She went to the library, and they're like, oh, most youth don't go to the library because it's on the other side of the park, and they have to cross gang boundaries. The hours aren't accessible for youth, right? Because they were limited hours and they were closed on weekends. A lot of youth have to work, and so it's not easy for them. And so where it was happening was actually in like businesses, community-based organizations. There was a bike shop in the community that employed a lot of youth, and they had a homework help. So whenever they had downtime, they would do homework. They had bookshelves where people could put books, and they would borrow books and give recommendations. So and that was, and that's, I think, sometimes a lot of issues with community studies that don't really engage, studies in communities that don't engage community members, is they end up with findings that aren't really meaningful because they haven't gone to the right places. They haven't consulted community members to find where the authentic spaces are and to get really a sense of what's going on. So she could have concluded from going to the library like, oh, people here don't read. Oh, the youth don't use the library, or they don't engage in reading resources, instead of looking at, well, what are some of the barriers to them doing that, and where are some of the places that they are engaging in literacy. So that was really important example of that kind of cross-training. And we mapped out salient community locations in there. You might conduct interviews and or focus groups as part of teams. I think this is really important. Often community members can ask questions that I never would have thought of asking, in terms of developing an interview guide. And then analysis is a collective coding process, right, that brings diverse knowledge. And this is another thing I think with a lot of community-based models, it's kind of assumed, oh, in the research assistance model, that community members can go out and collect data, but maybe analysis is going to be too much, right? And again, that's not valuing their theoretical knowledge and expertise. So really very, very important to bring together community partners to understand data, identify issues, patterns, themes, and trends. And I found that part of those processes, there's coding and analysis and things that I never would have relevant to me, with my own perspective and lens. And I think that really pushes against this whole idea of objectivity in research. We need subjectivities in research because it helps us make better sense of the data and also come up with more meaningful findings. So then dissemination in CBQR often looks really different. We have like often a culminating event or forum where you're bringing together researchers, leaders, practitioners, community members, and stakeholders to share, discuss findings, to gain feedback and identify next steps. You might do journal articles, which I think is also a really important part of that process of doing research, and it can be a great mentorship process for youth in terms of doing that. And I do know Jason Elisari, who's done a lot of Youth Participatory Action Research co-authored a book with students that were part of his project. You might do conference presentations and invited sessions. And I've done a lot of these. The only caveat there is that a lot of conferences aren't really well set up for youth and community members. And so I've brought folks to American Educational Research Association and done fundraising to get them there, right? And then when we go, there's not a lot of people in attendance, right? And I feel like that it's very demoralizing, and I don't want to set people up that way. So after some of those experiences, I've decided I'm only going to go to conferences where I feel like the organizers are going to recruit people and show that they value it, and that it's going to be an authentic, really genuine sort of opportunity for them to share their experiences and their knowledge. You might do policy reports and lobbying days, to advocate for positions and expanded programs, lobby legislators. The alternative school I work with does a lot of that with some local reproductive justice organizations. Grant proposals can be a really great result from a dissemination effort from a community-based research study where you identify something that needs to be expanded. So let's get some money for it. And so I have a student actually, I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, but I started an Engaged Scholars program, a research practice partnership in the College of Education. And this is kind of its pilot year. It was an awkward year to have a pilot year or something like this because, we started at the beginning of the year and got folks out there, and then we had to go remote. And so it's been a slower process, but I have one student who she's working with the alternative school that I work with on their greenhouse. They have a greenhouse that was actually initiated as part of another community-based kind of partnership with Rush and Mount Sinai, a bunch of different partners to try to address issues of diabetes in the community, right? And so the students at the school created a greenhouse, but this has now been almost 20 years, right? And so the greenhouse needs to be refurbished. So she's actually working with, and this was a problem, an issue that they identified with teachers at the school to try to align the greenhouse more with the science and health curriculum that they have. So it kind of been used to grow stuff, but it hadn't been connected with the science teaching, even though it was located right off of the science classroom. And so now things are happening remotely, but she's writing grants and trying to get some funding to refurbish it. And she's doing focus groups online to talk to students about what would be useful to them. So that's a really great example of how you can use CBQR to expand and strengthen existing resources. And then social media is really important. More and more, I think my research has changed a lot because I'm analyzing social media, because that's what, if I want to know what youth are talking about, that's where I have to go. But I'm also using it to share a lot more of my research findings and get the word out and engage more diverse audience than just with a journal article. Oops, I don't know what happened to my presentation. Can you still see it?
No, it went away.
Oh, yeah, something shut down.
Did it glitch?
Yeah, there's a glitch. We get those.
All the time.
Yes, especially right when we don't want to get them.
We're at 12:36, so now you can see your clock, but I just want to let you know.
Oh, okay, yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
Okay, here it is. All right, can you see it again now?
There you
Yep.
go,
Okay, good. Okay, so I'll talk, I only have 20 minutes left. I was talking with Alicia. I can always, I think, I can talk about this for hours and hours. So I usually need to edit down things. I end up with, I think I started and I had maybe 40 something slides. I'm like, I'm gonna have to do a little less. So I'll just go a little bit through this. I've already talked about some elements of the project, and then I want to talk about kind of next steps and partnerships and kind of what we can learn from this as also universities. But so I've been working, I actually founded this program, Proyecto Atabe, which is a mentorship and support program for pregnant and parenting youth, and came out of research. I had a sabbatical, and my dissertation was a very traditional sort of ethnography, even though I had existing relationships with this community because I had been the director of this family literacy program. I still was kind of the authority, had the research questions and did the, where I sit in the corner, and I did a lot of participant observation in sorts of community events, but I wrote it up in a very kind of traditional ethnographic way, right? That where it didn't involve a lot of collaboration in terms of analysis and dissemination with partners. And so as I've kind of moved towards this, more community-based research and looking at communities as intellectual spaces, I did a brief study where we did discussion groups. I worked with the director of this family literacy program. We discussion groups with young parents to find out what it is that they were interested in having to support them. And I remember, I still have her voice in my head, you know, she was like, just bring us people who know something. I want them to know something, you know? So she really wanted, you know, they wanted mentors, but they wanted mentors who had similar experiences, but also knew something, right? So people who had followed a similar trajectory to them, who were from the neighborhood, who had parents at a young age, because that was a lot of things. So like, don't give us mentors who had, you know, had kids in their 20s, 30s, 40s, right? We want teen parents, you know, former teen parents, and who knows something, right? And so we developed this mentorship and advocacy program that recruited former young parents to provide presentations and promote advocacy skills. And so part of the data collection that's been ongoing is I do observations of classes. I also co-teach a class, and now I'm co-teaching that online. I do interviews with participants, but then I also work with staff to do interviews with participants and discussion groups. And then as part of the class, I teach research skills with them, and then they identify issues that they want to study. So they, some of the projects they've done is they design a survey to identify school-based services and resources in Chicago. They've interviewed each other for podcasts. We created a PPY council to hold schools accountable for providing services. So for example, all public schools in Illinois are supposed to have services for nursing and pumping, right? They don't. And so that was something we were going to develop, and still in the process of doing this, develop a checklist to give to schools for that. And then some dissemination. They've presented workshops, panels at national conferences. So I just actually got a memory in my Facebook feed of a local conference that I presented at many, many years ago. Some young parents who are now educational leaders. So one of them works at the, is a lead teacher at the local early childhood program. We've written grants to fund the program. So I've received a number of grants to pay mentors and I've gotten some seed grants from NIU, and I'm waiting to hear about another grant to pay co-researchers and provide some funding to continue the research. We've created public service announcements and other materials. So part of the program is also to challenge negative stereotypes about young parents. We organized a PPY mentorship and advocacy day. And then right now, and I did have a little seed funding for this, it's just been hard with online, the remote learning. I don't get to meet with them as regularly as I used to. So, and I have money for food. So I was like, well, I'll just have lunch delivered to their houses while we meet. I think that's what I'm gonna do. We wanna create a PPY guide on navigating school parenting and resources. So a very PPY focused guide, and then even a guide for allies who work with PPY. So here's just some social media things that share. So some important things that I think we need to talk about, you know, in terms of evaluating these projects is how is project benefiting the community? And here I'm pointing to some key studies by Kinloch and Moji, and thinking about the credibility of the study rather than traditional notions of research like reliability and validity. And we're much more interested in kind of discovering certain issues, right, concrete and specifically within local and particular contexts, this idea of particularizability versus generalizability as ways that we can evaluate our project. And then community-based studies should really be judged in terms of their authenticity. And here I'm citing the research of FINE, who's done a lot of participatory action research and youth participatory action research, the extent to which they bring together individuals with a variety of skills and expertise to collaboratively and collectively make sense of data. And then I developed this idea of dialogic reflexivity and accountability, wherein researchers engage self-critically and collectively with the experiences of teaching, learning, and doing community-based research at all levels of the project, right? So some benefits of this approach, and there are many, I think, in my opinion, it helps community-based organizations and programs develop programs that are aligned with needs and interests of community members. So bringing some of expertise and research in order to identify issues and problems that could be addressed within the organization. And it can help organizations strengthen programming and services so as to be more meaningful and useful and adapt to changing interests and needs within their community. This sort of research can really build research on leadership skills and capacity within organizations and communities. And I've talked about a lot of the youth that I've worked with have really become vocal advocates and said that being involved in these kind of projects help open new worlds to them, right? And the ability to be able to travel and present at conferences really impacted them. And that it really fosters meaningful dialogue and relationships between universities, community organizations, and community members. And then this, I think, is, I mentioned this already, that I feel like with these studies, the findings are often more authentic and accurate because they're really premised on local knowledge and understandings rather than outsiders' perspectives. And there's so many examples of studies where the findings end up being wrong-headed because they never, like I said, never collaborated with community members. They didn't go to the right spaces and places in order to collect data, and they couldn't make sense of the data in ways that insiders could. Now, challenges. There's also a lot of challenges. So like I said, building trust and rapport, you can't just pop into a community and say, hey, I want to do some research here. And oftentimes that's just not going to fly. People are like, we don't know you. You know, who are you? And really fostering equitable relationships, especially given the unequal power relationships between universities, organizations, and communities, as well as within the organization and community. So like, there's a lot of power relationships within the organization and within community that need to be navigated and negotiated and that take a lot of time. In my book, I talk about this idea of checking your privilege. We did some interviews with community members about what their expectations were of people from the outside coming in. And they said, you know, we want you to check your privilege, know why you're here, and talk to us, respect us, listen to us, right? So that's really important. And as I mentioned before, it really, this can be tricky. It involves a radical repositioning and really a reversal of traditional research roles. So that academic researchers who are often viewed as being experts, they have to cede a certain amount of power and authority within the project, and that can be really difficult. Time management, so we need to also be mindful of piling on additional responsibilities for community partners. Yeah, we want them to be equal partners, but there might be some things where they're like, no, actually we'd like you to do that, right? Because we don't have time, right? Or finding money, like how can we support them to do this work, which might include hiring some new people. And allowing for multiple voices and perspectives, resources, and then the demands of tenure process for faculty. This is something we need to work on in the university of respecting that. And I feel like actually the discussions I've been having lately, we're really tackling this. And I think it's really important of how does this sort of work get valued and viewed as research? And then also, when is this over, right? So when does it end? It's important to have sustainability in these projects so that they're not just tied with a class, that when the class is over, everyone leaves and the project ends, you know, so how do you do that? But then also, how long should it go on? So they often take place over a long period of time, but you sometimes do need to decide an exit strategy. And so I really like this quote from Ken Logue: the project at the heart of the partnership lives for as long as the community it serves believes it is needed. And so that's really important too. There's often tensions and frictions that come out of this sort of research, and differences of opinion will inevitably arise, and they shouldn't be viewed as obstacles. They should offer opportunities for reassessing project goals, negotiating relationships of research team members in really important, insightful ways. And Larson has this idea in the Ken Logue piece of generative frictions. You know, how do you have frictions that actually generate some new ideas and lead the project in some exciting directions? And then I've also been really inspired by the work of Tuhaji Smith on decolonizing methodologies. And this work I feel like is very much a part of that. And I've already talked about kind of taking on these notions of objectivity, that we really need to look to indigenous knowledges as sources of theoretical understanding about a whole host of phenomena and practices. And there's lots of examples of this, of indigenous practices on climate change and fishing and water and agriculture that really we could learn a lot from, right? And that we need to grapple with and confront the roles of academic researchers really as perpetuating oppression and inequities and benefiting from discrimination and structural and actual violence. And there have been some examples of universities that have been taking that on. So we really need new views, initiatives that are premised on local knowledge and needs, really relationships that are asymmetrical, weighed towards community leadership and authority, and look at projects that really address broader conditions rather than these one-shot service days, looking at sustained and continuous partnerships, and really have ongoing discussion and dialogue, looking at inequities and painful histories, and transform university policies and practices, really open up paths, use research to open up paths for reconciliation and reparation. And so I think I'm almost out of time, right? Where I'm at, yeah?
47.
Oh, okay. So there's still some time. I only have a few slides left, but now a lot of universities are moving towards this idea of engaged scholarship. In my own college, where we have a task force where we're looking at kind of how we can develop research practice partnerships. But this idea of this is from Brown University, this kind of co-creation of knowledge that shifts the positions of students and community groups from knowledge consumers to knowledge producers and partners in problem solving. So very much akin to the kind of communities as intellectual spaces. And that it's a way to really redress the disconnect between academic research and practical knowledge and really develop meaningful solutions to solve all sorts of community issues and problems. And I borrowed this from CU Boulder's Continuum of Engagement conceptual map, looking at kind of this to, for, with, that we want to move from the to or about to the with, and having much more participatory shared ownership and relationship building and collaboration and communication in our partnerships with communities. So I have a little bit of time for any questions or comments. I'd really love to hear from folks who do this work, maybe some ideas from your own work that have been found helpful, kind of characteristics of that work, or certain results that you are really excited about that you could share with us.
Yes, if you want to put your questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can wave your hand in your reactions, and then you can also I can unmute you then at that point. I know we did have a question, Laura, if you wanted to share your slides, and that's up to you.
I can share the slides, yeah, for sure.
Okay, if you just send them to me, then I'll make sure that
okay.
I attach them to the email that'll go out to everybody. There's so many good ideas that you presented to us, and the challenges, and I like that it's presented on a continuum, because we always can be better and do better.
Yeah.
In this, and it's not it is aspirational for sure. So
and I think we want to stay on, because I've done projects where it's more suitable for research collaborators, right? And so I think we want to be at that end of the continuum, but also in ways that make sense for the kind of projects and relationships we're building, right?
Now, you've worked a lot in the neighborhood where you are. Is that something that you've just dug in there? This is going to probably carry your research in that area, because that's where your relationships are based.
Yeah, and I think that's really important too. I mean, I've had people approach me like, how can I get in there? I was like, well, it's not really me to say that you can.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, for me, it was also a frustration. When I was in graduate school, I went to graduate school in Berkeley, so I left the community to do that. And I would do these projects and for my classes, and then it would end and I would have to leave. And it always, I would make promises about, I can continue doing this, and I just couldn't, right? And so from those experiences, I decided I was going to, this is a community I already had a relationship with, and invest in that community and build relationships over sustained time, which I think is really important. And it changes, it transforms. I have different levels of involvement depending on some other things and some needs in the community. And I still have to build relationships with individual pregnant and parenting youth every year, every time we have class. So it's a continual negotiation. And even as my role has changed, right? So when I started this work, I wasn't a mom. Now I am. So that changes my view. It changes my relationship with participants too. My daughter was going to childcare. I'm an older mom. And so she was going to childcare with a lot of the kids of parents that I taught. And I've taught my students' parents.
Really?
So, yeah. Because I started in the 90s, right? And
that is an engaged research agenda.
I might be working on grandparents now soon too. So, and I still have a lot of relationships. So I think it is really, really important, but it's not easy. I wouldn't say it's to build these sorts of relationships. I've been very fortunate because of my background as a community activist. Yeah, community compensation, that's good. Yeah, and I have too, so I was just writing, Brianna, I just had a discussion where, we're talking about working with community partners, and someone's like, well, we want to make sure they're invested, so they need to give something in terms of resources or money. And I really
cringed.
Well, I think it depends on the kind of organizations. If you're working with larger schools and school districts, they might have the resources to do that. And maybe, and I can see you have experiences where people aren't invested because maybe they haven't brought something in that way to the table. But for me, I work with very grassroots community-based organizations. So I always want to pay people. I always make sure that I have money for food, I have childcare, all these things. I can't, if I'm saying this is what we should be providing as a society and in my research, then I have to do that. I have to model that in my own activities, right? And I try to give stipends, and so I've had to work a lot in order to get that, but when youth would come to meetings, I would give them $25 to come to a meeting. And I think that's really important, and it values their time. And I think for them, that makes it more important for them to come, right? Because they feel like their time is being valued. Yeah, and I think that's really important. That's one of the things that being humble. There's so much else I could have talked about and kind of orientations toward doing this work, but being humble, listening. I've learned so much from the community. I mean, I can't possibly pay back, and I'm continually learning. And I think that's really important, especially in this time now, you know, when we think about like, how do we do anti-racist work? And part of that is to hang out in non-white spaces, for us white people to hang out as much as possible in non-white spaces, and decenter yourself, right? And listen and be humble and learn. So so I think that is really important. That came out of a lot of interviews that we did with community members about why they bristled, you know, or they were resistant to people coming work, because they do come in and just kind of tell them what to do, or assume that they don't have knowledge or expertise to share, and don't value it. So thank you.
Laura, you talked a lot about how sometimes researchers, we reach into communities, we reach out to them saying,
Yeah.
here's what I need, what can you give me?
Yes.
But the community organizations themselves, I think a university, because they view us as, you know, this big thing,
Yeah.
how do they connect with researchers to say, we could use some help here, we could use some
Yes.
assistance, we could use some maybe different training that we don't have?
Yeah.
For the nonprofits that are on this call, what's the best way to kind of start to build the relationships the other way, so that you're coming to the university and say, we could use some research support?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I would love to hear if people have ideas for that. I think we need to do a better job of opening up spaces for that, not just expecting, well, no one's come to tell us that this is what they need.
They just don't know where to go.
Yeah, and so some of that could be that you have like part of the ideas we were talking about in this research partnership task force was, how do we build like pitches, right? You know, and like, and have those discussions. And maybe we need to have more times, you know, I in all the work that I do, like where I've worked with community partners and youth, I usually want, even when, so say I bring students to campus for a tour, I usually have people from the university go out to the community first, right? Before we come on tour, and they request that, like, so that they can get to know the students and the youth and where they come from before
where they are,
the tour, and make the tour customized just for them.
Yeah.
But I think we need to open more of those dialogue and spaces, and don't just bring community folks to campus, but or just go out into the community, but have this really kind of bi-directional, like I said, cross training.
Yeah, I like that idea of having community members, or inviting community members to talk about their research needs, and then we can find people that might be able to help them.
Yes, and
rather
so
than
aligned. Like, you want to make sure you don't want to set up a project where people are coming in, you know, the academic researchers, like, I have this expertise. I'm like, well, that doesn't really match what we do. And you know, in the Youth Connection Charter School that I work with, we had to have lots and lots of meetings, you know, first where the dean would come out and we would discuss some ideas, and then from those identify which ones were feasible, and then refine those. But then once we had students who wanted to do their dissertation work in this engaged scholar way, then they had to come out, you know, to be vetted and talked about. And so it does involve a lot, and this is one of the time-consuming aspects of that, a lot of discussion at the outset to make sure that people are on the same page, and that they're well aligned, and that there's orientations, and that it's going to be a productive. The worst thing we can do is to start these things and then have them be unsuccessful or disempowering and devaluing, you know, right? Because we didn't set them up with resources, appropriate resources to be successful, right?
So you also guide a lot of doctoral students and early tenure track kind of academics.
Yeah.
How do you counsel them on choosing this as their career path?
Yeah, that's a hard one. And I'm glad, like, I'm lucky to be in a college where this work is supported, right? And so I have it. I mean, it's still a lot of it I have to devote my own time and resources to, which I'm happy to do because it's important. And that's one of the reasons I live in the city. You know, I used to get a lot of pushback. Well, you live in the city. Why do you live in the city? I was like, well, this is where my research and community work is happening. So it's important. But I think, you know, we need to, you know, find mentors who do this work, who can help advocate for you, and, you know, show people. I mean, there's all sorts of scholars all over who's doing this work, you know, and I think that we need to kind of provide that evidence of how this is valued, right? And also how, like I said, the findings can often be more meaningful and more relevant. If we talk about having relevant research findings, you know, doing these sorts of partnerships where community members can inform our design and study, I think are really important. So that's what I would say. As far as students, you know, I have a lot of students in the College of Education. We have a lot of students who are practitioners, and they love the idea of doing this work, right? And so, but and luckily our college is very supportive of the idea of more alternative sorts of pathways to dissertations, and I think that's important. And I think academia is moving in that way. So we just need to further advocate for that. But there's all sorts of you know, if you look up engaged scholar, there's universities all over doing this, you know, and seeing this as something that they really need to do, right?
How do you deal with, for example, if a community they define a research issue or an issue that they want some support with, but it's maybe out of your area of expertise?
Yeah.
How does this interdisciplinary stuff kind of bump
Yeah.
into community-based research, because they don't
Well,
view
I
things in
think
disciplines?
organizations like like the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies, you know, developing a storehouse of areas of expertise so that we can, you know, we can better align those things. Yeah, I think is important. But I mean, I do have, like, so with the, you know, with the engaged scholars, you know, it did take a lot of discussion for us to identify, and also, I mean, I didn't mention this, some of it is that I think a lot of community-based organizations are so used to academic scholars coming in and saying, this is what I want to do, give me people, that a lot of it is a discussion about, no, that's not what this is going to be, right? You know, and like,
Right.
so thinking about how people, and again, navigating some of the different voices in an organization, there's relationships of power in there. So how do you navigate those? But it does take quite a bit of work, and finding a good fit, right? You know, so, you know, I like this idea though, and I think we're going to work on this, of having some kind of institute that brings together organizations and academics and community leaders and students to have discussions and say, you know, like, one of the members of this task force was saying it's kind of like a, you know, first date, speed dating,
Right,
like
right.
that, where you can make a good match, because I mean, we
Right.
have so much expertise at a place like Northern and so much knowledge.
Yeah.
I think we could address anything. And I'm lucky in the community that I worked in, you know, there's so many issues. I never found an issue where a student doing a class didn't have anything to study. They always
Right.
found it something that resonated with their interest, and that they could collaborate on.
Well, we're coming up to the end of time, so I will send slides. Kind of a couple of reminders. You'll get an email with a link to an evaluation, the recording, and Laura will send me her slides, so I'll send that out. If anyone is interested, tomorrow we have another program from 12 to 1 about museums' response to COVID-19. We have a professor who's going to talk about it globally, a local example, and then I'm going to kind of talk about some examples at an organizational level. Laura is speaking today, which is part of our speaker series. So our next speaker series will actually be in February with Dr. Schuler. He was on earlier and then had to run to class. He has a new book coming out in February around humanity's last stand, confronting global catastrophe. So we're excited to hear from that.
Wow.
And another professor also in sociology, Dr. Diane Rogers, is going to talk about her book, Children in Social Movements, and what does that look like? So that's our speaker series. It's coming up February and March. And then we're doing these also kind of 1 hour lunchtime talks on real talk and big ideas, where we actually take a researcher and a practitioner that's out there and look at a particular topic from two sides. The next one will be November 17th on philanthropy. And in the spring, we're going to talk about advocacy and civic engagement and innovation. Those are some of our bigger topics. Also in the spring coming up, we have civics for nonprofits. What a nonprofit organization's staff and board members need to know about government. That'll come up at the end of January. And then some more workshops on data for grant proposals. So lots of ways you can connect with the center. And I want to thank Dr. Johnson for joining us today. I'll put her, you can find her at NIU. You can find me at NIU. The best way to get a hold of us right now is by email.
Yep.
Because no one's on campus, unfortunately. So we could all give you a virtual round of applause.
Yes. Well,
thank you so much.
For sharing ideas. Yep. All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Al.
Bye. Yeah.